By 1675, a strategic coexistence between the English settlers and the Native American population of New England was strained to the breaking point. The settlers' unquenchable hunger for Indian land and the unyielding attitude of the Massachusetts and Plymouth Bay Colonies had angered the great Wampanoag chief Metacom, named King Philip by the English. The hostilities that ensued over the next 18 months came to be known as King Philip's War.
Of all of the imports that the English brought to the New World in the 16th and 17th century, the most profound was European disease. And we believe now that the Native American population may have declined by as much as 90% in the 100 years before King Philip's War.
When you look at the accounts that were written in 1677 and 1678, the English take no culpability for the war. They perceive that a people they think that they were taking care of. The English had a paternal view of native peoples. They felt that the natives had unjustly arisen against them.
Our people knew which way the chips were falling. They knew because of the diseases that were spreading. They knew because the Indian people were prohibited from planting their gardens.
The English were, this is my culture and my culture is right and I am here by the grace of God, and if these natives all get sick, it's by the grace of God that we should move into their village.
The English were spreading out and they were occupying Indian land and building villages, in permanent villages, not villages that were transitional, but they were there to stay.
King Philip's War was a very brief conflict, but very bloody. On a per capita basis, it was the bloodiest war in America's history. It began in June of 1675, and with the death of King Philip in August of 1676, it ended in southern New England.
And it really was a deciding factor into who got the country, because it wasn't us.
Philip was the son of Usamiquin, who we know as Massasoit. He took the name Philip shortly after his father's death, hence the term King Philip's War.
He was the figurehead of this uprising because it started in his homeland at the Potomac Peninsula at Mount Hope.
Beautiful site in which King Philip was able to survey all of the harbor that leads into Seekonk and Fall River. King Philip was able to convince other Indian leaders, fighters, that they had to do the same thing. They had to protect their land. They had to fight the English.
Well, King Philip's War was about land in the same way that the Civil War was about slavery. It was about the English from time to time letting their livestock loose on native crops to destroy the crops so that they could then take possession of the land. It was about English missionaries visiting with the Native Americans and attempting to convert them to Christianity.
There were more English than there were Native Americans here in New England, and so English power is rising, Native American power is declining, and English laws are starting to supersede tribal custom.
Native view of ownership of land was entirely different from European view. European people didn't understand the native view, and the native people did not understand the European view. The Wampanoag didn't understand they were signing away areas of land forever. It was just, oh, well, these people will sign this and we'll make a trade of some sort, and they had the use of this land.
In the Indian civilization, you would stay in one place 3, no more than 4 years for your summer habitation. Then you would move to another favorable place and allow the Earth Mother to replenish those things that had been used. But the English people had a different way, and the other European people. And as they clustered more and more, They kept using all of the natural resources in ever-widening circles.
In John Easton's account, the natives that he spoke with accused the English of getting sachems drunk at the time of land transactions, so that the sachems sold much more land than they were conscious of. They also said that English paper never said the same thing twice, and that something someone had agreed to on paper in the field, when a native person appeared in court, it read differently.
The movement to the west was just uncontrolled. People were looking for land, a place where they could build a home, a community, and they didn't care whether it's on Indian land or anyone else's land. They just saw the land and took the opportunity to use it and take it over.
King Philip's War began in Swansea, Massachusetts in June of 1675, when a group of natives under Philip, but probably without Philip's permission, pillaged some of the homes in Swansea. One of them was shot by an English youth. He eventually died, and that led to retribution the next day in the beginning of the war.
Some Indians fell a-pilfering in some houses the English had left, and an old man and a lad, going to one of these houses, did see 3 Indians run out thereof. The old man bid the young lad to shoot, and so he did, and an Indian fell down but got away again. The following day, the Potomac killed 9 Swansea colonists in retribution. June 1675.
The war began at Swansea. Metacom was subsequently smart enough to ferry his people off the Mount Hope Peninsula. He didn't want to be trapped on this exposed point of land. He knew the colonies, the 3 different colonies, Mass Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, Connecticut Colony, were going to unite and come for him. So he was smart enough to get his people off that peninsula and hide them in the Pocasset swamps in modern-day Tiverton, Rhode Island.
On the Native American side, there were really 3 primary groups. There were the Wampanoag, who were made up of the Poconoket, who occupied what is today Warren and Bristol, Rhode Island, the Sakonnet in what is today Little Compton, the Pocasset in Fall River, and Tiverton, Rhode Island, and then the Nipmuc, who really occupied what would be central Massachusetts today, around the Worcester area, and the single most powerful tribe in New England, who were the Narragansett. Captain Thomas Wheeler led a group that was designed to negotiate with the Nipmuc to keep them out of King Philip's War. In modern-day New Braintree, Massachusetts, Wheeler and his group are ambushed. Wheeler is actually saved by his son. They retreat to Brookfield, where the historic siege of Brookfield occurs over the next 3 days.
They fired violently out of the swamp, and from behind the bushes in the hillside, and wounded me sorely, and shot my horse under me. We returned to the town as fast as the badness of the way and the weakness of our wounded men would permit, we being 10 miles from it. All the while we were going, we durst not stay to stop the bleeding of our wounded men, for fear the enemy should have surprised us yet again.
There were a handful of events that the colonists would have considered to be really watershed events in King Philip's War. The first that comes to mind is Bloody Brook in what is today South Deerfield, Massachusetts. This was a group of English soldiers and teamsters under Thomas Lathrop of Beverly, who were evacuating the town of Deerfield. They paused at a stream that was at that time called Muddy Brook to catch their breath and to rest for a moment, and they were ambushed by a group of Native Americans under Mutwump, considered one of the finest native military commanders of the war. The English were essentially wiped out, and at that point, the English colonists knew that this was a real war.
When the war began, fighting was done both in English and native ways, with the native ways being particularly effective. But through Benjamin Church, who was one of the premier leaders of Plymouth's militia, the English began to imitate native strategies and native techniques for fighting.
King Philip's War was fought on the English side by really men who were farmers. They were tailors, they were coopers. They weren't soldiers. And they would come together on training day every so often, and most of them didn't want to do it. And they would learn European techniques for fighting, which would be to stand en masse and shoot a volley at what was hopefully a force on the other side that was standing together.
The hill seemed to move, being covered with Indians who possessed themselves of every rock, stump, tree, or fence that was in sight. The enemy hailed Church's men with a shower of bullets. The woods rang with their constant yelling and shouting. Church had no other shelter but a small bank and a bit of water fence. After 6 hours' engagement with 300 Indians against some 20 men, and by a deliverance to the glory of God and his protecting providence, Captain Roger Golding's sloop arrived to rescue them. July 1675.
The Great Swamp Fight. That occurred in December of 1675. It was the largest battle of the war, the bloodiest. It occurred in what is today South Kingston, Rhode Island, at Conochet's Fort, which is a Narragansett fortified village.
And once they had gained entrance to the camp area from the one side where the breastworks of fortification had not been completed, they went in and massacred women and children and old men and set fire to as many of the 600 wigwams.
The English people had begun to set fire to the wigwams and houses, which Mr. Church had labored hard to prevent. For every wounded man might have a good warm house to lodge with baskets and tubs of grain sufficient to supply the whole army. The general balked, saying, "By tomorrow the wounded will be so stiff there will be no moving them." So, burning up all the houses and provisions in the fort, the army returned the same night in the storm and cold. December 1675.
I'm seeing in my mind's eye the horror that the people must have been confronted with, and those that were lucky enough to escape.
With the help of Indian Peter, we entered the cedar swamp and found some hundreds of wigwams and many small blockhouses. Our men valiantly scaled the fort and in a fierce fight for about an hour beat them thence from the blockhouses. By a fresh assault and a recruit of powder, the Indians fell on again and beat us out of the fort. By the great resolution and courage of General Winslow, we reinforced and very heartily entered the fort again and fired the wigwams with many living and dead persons in them. We estimate the enemy lost at least 200 men. Captain Mosley counted in one corner of the fort 64 men. Captain Gorham reckoned 150 at least. December 22nd, 1675.
There have never been recited to me the number of Wampanoag who were actually captured or who died in that confrontation.
Mary Rowlandson was an Englishwoman who was captured by some Wampanoag people during King Philip's War. While she was with them, I think she was treated rather well. She was a prisoner, but she was treated comparatively well and was returned to her family.
Mary wrote about her own capture and her travels through the western part of Massachusetts. She gave a very good account of the Indians, that they treated her well, although it was rough. She had to suffer the same hardships that the Indians did.
On the 10th of February, 1676, came the Indians in great numbers upon Lancaster. There were 5 persons taken in one house, a father, a mother, and a suckling child they knocked on the head. The other 2 they took and carried away alive. There were others set upon, one who begged for his life, but who had his body stripped naked and bowels split open. Another quickly shot down. February 1676.
Mary then spends about the next 10 weeks as a captive of the Native Americans, traveling with them throughout central Massachusetts and into New Hampshire.
Traveling now 3 days together without resting any day between them, at last, after many weary steps, I saw Wachusett's hills. Then came to a great swamp through which we traveled up to the knees in mud and water, which was heavy going to one tired before. Being almost spent, I thought I should have sunk down at last and never got out. But when my foot slipped, Thy mercy, O Lord, held me up. March 1676.
When the natives attack Sudbury and start to set the homes on fire, the soldiers from Marlborough come to the aid, but the natives lay down a perfect ambush. They're able to lure the soldiers into a trap where the natives then close the vise on them. Soldiers are able to fight their way out to a hilltop, get a defensive ring going. Things look pretty good for them, but the natives again come through, setting the hills on fire. The smoke and the flames force the soldiers off, and as they're trying to get off that hill, called Green's Hill, they're wiped out.
The Indians had killed 2 captains and 100 men at Sudbury. Yet they came home without that rejoicing and triumphing over their victory. They acted as if the devil had told them that they should gain a victory, but looked as if the devil had told them they should have a fall. Whether it was so or not, that summer they came to utter ruin. April 1676.
It's almost as if they've wasted too many warriors on these daring raids, and after Sudbury it almost seems that they're spent. It's the last great victory in King Philip's War for the Native Americans. The turning point begins to happen in the spring of 1676 when the natives are simply being worn down.
Natives were continually beaten back from their traditional fishing grounds, from their traditional planting grounds, so that by the spring of 1676 they've run out of food, they're sick, and then their leaders begin to be captured.
They haven't been able to grow their crops the prior summer. They're not able to plant their crops this spring in 1676. They're not even able to go to their traditional fishing grounds.
It became quite clear that the English were not going to go back to England or to anywhere else. They were not going to get into a boat and go away, and they certainly weren't going to allow the Wampanoag to go back and use their old territories.
Not all the tribes were aligned together with King Philip. Tribes like the Mohegans, the Nyantics were fighting and assisting the English. When they do take to the field and they're initiating contact with the enemy, they're always taking friendly Indians with them so they don't walk into ambushes.
After one Englishman's gun missing fire, a Captain Golding bid the friendly Indian alderman fire away. He did so and sent one musket bullet through Philip's heart, and another not above 2 inches from it. Philip fell upon his face in the mud and water, with his gun under him. Captain Church ordered his Indian executioner to behead and quarter King Philip, saying, "He caused many an Englishman's body to lie unburied and rot above ground." August 1676.
With the death of King Philip and the severing of his head and taking it to Plymouth as a warning to everybody else that they were in control, was probably the only significant thing which indicated that the end of the King Philip's War, at least as far as the colonists were concerned, was over. English then assumed complete control over the territory and the Indian people in it. They went in and met with people in the swamps, men, women, children, indiscriminately, they were either killed or sent into slavery, including the wife and son of King Philip.
You might even call it a form of ethnic cleansing. Even women and children were not spared. If you were a Native American woman or child, you were brought to Boston Common and you were sold into slavery and then shipped to Bermuda or the Caribbean. Males were brought into Boston and hung, beheaded, shot. And so the population of natives in southern New England was absolutely decimated. The few that could escape, they would go west towards the Mohawks or north and join up with the Abenakis. But there really were not too many natives left in southern New England after this war. Absolutely devastating to the population.
It wasn't any great military victory that turned this war, but it was a war of logistics, where the natives were continually beaten back from their traditional fishing grounds, from their traditional planting grounds, so that by the spring of 1676, they've run out of food, they're sick, and then their leaders begin to be captured.
So the Native Americans needed to be smart in their tactics and in their strategies, and over a period of time, I think it just wore down the natives, fighting against superior numbers, superior weapons, and even fighting against other Native Americans.
Awashank's female sachem wanted to keep her people from war. She wasn't able to do that, and she realized that they had to make peace somehow or other so that she and her people of Sakonnet could survive. And that meant having a land base, that meant being able to grow their food, that meant being able to hunt.
As future historians wrote about King Philip's War, they had very little source material. And in fact, the source material they had tended to be very Puritan in nature. It was Mather's history, it was Hubbard's history, both Puritan ministers. So the same sources are used over and over again in histories for several hundred years.
The colonial ministers were central in shaping the war. They used their pulpits to motivate the soldiers. They used their pulpits to interpret what was going on in the battlefield. They were also the historians of the day. They were keeping the accounts and shaping the framework as to how the war would be interpreted both here in New England and back in England.
The colonists wanted to create an image that they were humanitarian, law-abiding, they had justification for war, and so all of their books were written to project that kind of an image.
The war is being brought to the forefront of, you know, the consciousness of the country anyway, because it was a very important war, and to not include it in American history is just another way of making Native people invisible.
It can only be changed by the truth, and the truth lies in the records and the diaries of those people that came before, and the correct interpretation of what they were writing and how it was seen or witnessed by them. Yes, the truth can come forward.
This is where we need to bring together those people who need accurate information and do the research and bring about the balance that everybody's looking for with the Indians and the whites. And the King Philip's War is one of the places where it can start.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.